very much, Patrick. Okay, are you able to see me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, because I can't see anybody. I remember that from last week. So we're talking about envisioning the kingdom, and this in our second week, we're going to ask, what is the world that we want? What is the world that God wants? And we're going to look at where we're at right now. What is the human impact on the world? What happened to get here? What kind of world God wants? What needs to change? What are some things being done? And examples of Christians leading in that. So sometimes I do this with students. I have them talk about the word human and all the related words: inhumane, subhuman, superhuman, or natural, unnatural, and supernatural, and related words. But if you look them up and look for pictures, you're likely to find pictures that look like this. If you look up humans, you'll find the top picture. And if you look up nature, you'll find the bottom picture. That is, it's very clear that when we think about humans, we're not thinking that they are a part of nature. However, if you look up humans and nature together, you'll get a photo like this one, or you'll get a lot of art. Very, very idealized, beautiful pictures of usually just a few individuals in a gorgeous landscape.
Dorothy, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure you're sharing your screen.
Oh, okay. Well, I have a beautiful picture of Kashmir. Let me just have that. Let's just okay, let's try again. Now am I sharing?
Yes, now we're seeing, yes.
But hold on. You guys, I'm so sorry I said all that introductory stuff without the slides. But you got enough of my cheerful face, so here we go. Anyway, these were the pictures I was showing when I was saying about people. Thank you for leaping in there and telling me that you couldn't see them. This is the picture of humans in nature. But the world that we actually live in works a little bit differently than that. Humans have a tremendously outsized impact on the rest of non-human creation. And you can see that when we try to assess something called the footprint. You could have a footprint, the church could have a footprint, or the whole global human population can have a footprint, and it is the measure of the amount of land and water bodies that are necessary to provide us with the things that we use and to allow the cycling of nutrients and other jobs that ecosystems provide. You can see here an estimate of how we would calculate that for different parts of the world. If we were to look back, especially over the past several centuries, we would see that the human footprint of humanity has tremendously increased, and that rate of increase has been much, much bigger since 1970. So, unfortunately, during that time, many measures of environmental health have decreased. Okay. So I was going to ask you a question, but of course I can't see you answer me. So I was going to, if we could have, I would have asked this first question. I would have asked, if you took all the mammals on Earth that are terrestrial by weight, so you just weighed them, what % of that biomass would be wild animals? Now, you already know the answer. It is 4%. Only 4% are wild animals. 96% are livestock and humans. 60% of the total is livestock, and the 7.8 billion people that we have is 36% of the wild mammal biomass. Since we were having a dramatic impact on the environment, about 83% of wild mammals and half of the plants or plant cover has been removed. That is, we've had a tremendous loss of that. Most of life, though, is plants. I don't know if you know this, but if you took the bacteria out and the plants out on Earth, only 5% would be anything that wasn't bacteria or plants. And actually, I'm going to say that fungi are so intimately connected with the roots of plants that might include fungi a little bit too. But humans make only 0.01% of Earth's total biomass, but we have a very outsized impact. Most of living things are on land. I'm not sure if you knew that. There's a whole bunch that are very deep under the surface of the Earth that are bacteria, but only about 1% is in the ocean, which is way less than I personally would have suspected if I hadn't seen this paper that came out in 2019 that these graphics illustrate. And likewise with poultry, 70% of birds are poultry and 30% are wild. Now, let's look at the US environmental footprint. And I've just got 3 things here, 2 with a graph and 1 with just a statement. Well, one of the things that you can see is what has happened with housing. The new single-family US houses and what has happened in comparison to household size. That is, how many people are in the house. And you can see, this goes back to 1970, that the number of people per house has declined, and that the square feet per person and the total size of house has increased. So that from 1970 to today, average houses are about 1,000 square feet bigger. If we looked at other measures like meat eating, and we eat significantly more meat than we did in 1970, the vehicle miles traveled is in this lower graph, and this is per person, and they have increased. So there was a real dip in there for a little bit in the 2000s and the early teens. And then one of the things that we have an outsized impact is on the unfortunate waste of food. So in 2015, there was a study that showed that more food was landfilled than any other trash material that was in the US. Around 22% of food lands in a landfill, and the amount of food that is wasted or lost to use between the farm and the table is much higher than that. Actually, globally, it's between 30 and 40%. At the same time, in the last number of decades, wealth inequality globally and in the United States has increased. That is not only income, but it's also wealth that is held by families, for example, and land. So Oxfam International, which you may be aware of as a very large international development agency, put out a report that found that 8 rich people, 6 of them Americans, own as much combined wealth as half of the human race. Likewise, this is the upper graph is from 2013. But at that point, the top 10% of families owned 76% of the wealth. This is in America. And the bottom 50% holds only 1%. But this isn't true just in in a broad picture. In Brazil, for example, where land is what is the biggest wealth, an estimated 1% of the population owns 45% of the land, and many families are landless. Now, I realize that this sounds like a lot of downer material, and I'm not going to leave a stick here, but I do want you to be familiar with a couple of other ideas. I'm sorry, yeah, whatever. I just have this distracting thing on my screen. So this is called Earth Overshoot Day. It is the day when if we took the number of Earths that it takes to support the global population, it's more than one Earth. And so there's two ways we're still alive here. One is that we are dipping into the future. That is, we're doing things that are not sustainable, and the Earth is not, doesn't have as many resources for our children as it did when I was born. And the other is that because of inequality, we in America use more of resources than other places. So if everybody in America, if everybody in the globe lived like America, we'd need something around 4 Earths to support everybody. So that's not possible. But the global average is 1.75 Earths. That is, if we took everybody, we're still running a deficit in terms of what we're doing. So here, this goes up to 2019, and this shows not only how the same measurement has changed over time, but how for the globe, when is it in the calendar year that we have used up essentially all of the resources we ought to be using up for the year? That is, the earliest that date is, the worse. And the later that date is, the better. So for the world as a whole, it's August 1st in 2019. For the US alone, it's March 14th. That is, that's much earlier in the year. So that's a concept that I think would be useful to have. The effect of humanity on the entire world and other living creatures, but also light and water and rocks and everything, is so amazingly big that we are now calling this time period the Anthropocene. That is to contrast it with the Holocene, the most recent geologic time that we were in. And if you don't recognize that, you might recognize the name for the one before that, which was the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene was when, if you know the movies about Ice Age 1 and 2, those kinds of things, they were set in the Pleistocene. But we're trying to come up with terminology to describe this amazing, mind-boggling, giant time that we're in. And the Anthropocene is a word that a lot of people are using to describe that. So some of what we are looking at is really destructive. And we could ask, what happened? And different people will give you different answers. In 1968, Lynn White Jr. wrote a paper in which he said that much of the burden of blame is on Christianity. That Christianity set up the situation for science in the Middle Ages, and that science allowed technology to run forward, and that was the reason we ended up overusing resources. Norman Wurzba, who's writing more modernly, he's a Christian, and he says that it's modernity that came out of the Great Enlightenment, that scientific and technological thinking is what did it. Garrett Hardin, who wrote back in 1968 along with Lynn White Jr., said, it is always going to be destructive to have an unregulated common resource. And Louis Moncrief, who was responding to Lynn White Jr., said, cultural factors were much more than religious factors. For example, the rise of democracy and individualism was to blame. And then Wiseman and Davis said in 2013 that the Protestant work ethic, which had been blamed for this as well, wasn't completely to blame, but it had been transformed in the United States into an ethic of hard work and coupled with consumerism. There are some other opinions, and this one came out in, this paper came out in 2019. It blames Christianity via individualism, saying that our early church's ban on marriage between cousins, first and second cousins, or anybody closer, weakened kinship structures and promoted independence, nonconformity, and a willingness to work with strangers. Those characteristics then made the psyche of Western industrialized nations, and that led to the destruction of the environment. Now, I'm going to go back just for a second and say there's other ideas, because every single one of these presumes that it's relatively recent. But if you were to look, ancient Aztecs, ancient Chinese, the Polynesian wayfarers who came to land on South Sea Islands. Every place that humans have come where they weren't before has resulted in an extinction of large mammals locally and other effects. So it's not necessarily that that it's all due to the Middle Ages and newer. And the role of Christianity is always a question. But I definitely see when I'm talking to fellow Christians, especially Americans, some things that seem like an imbalanced view of the understanding of Scripture. For example, God has many examples of wealthy people in the Bible whose wealth signifies God's favor. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Job, who is rewarded in the end of the book of Job after all of his suffering with more wealth and more family members and more flocks than he started with. Solomon, God's own, who was given wisdom and tremendous wealth. Another idea in the Bible that I think people emphasize too much is property rights, that you can't take away from people, that it's okay to own things individually is fine, but it's going to be balanced by some other things. The idea that hard work leads to success is something that the Protestant work ethic emphasizes. And because we believe in the sovereignty of God and God's provision, and we're grateful, The idea that God provides abundantly is something that people emphasize. The downside of this is that sometimes we de-emphasize some other ideas in the Bible. God's special care of the poor and not discriminating on the basis of wealth are ideas that are emphasized tremendously, especially in the book of James and in Proverbs and Psalms and many other places. The idea for the need for just systems, that the system should be set up so that people have a place to go, that the law should be fair, that nobody should lie. People shouldn't just be able to take things. That principle is not always held as strongly as the individual rights that we hold so dearly. The idea that people can be poor and not at fault for that is clear in the Bible many, many times. And so I think that's something that we sometimes de-emphasize. And likewise, the Bible says repeatedly, but especially in the Proverbs, that we're to plan wisely, that limits are real, and we are to plan. One good example of that is when Joseph went to Egypt and saw that by God's grace was able to understand that famine was coming, and he very wisely and was given the authority to plan ahead so that people did not starve. We're at a very special moment in time. Not only that, we're at 2020, not only all the things I described about the impact we have, but also in this moment of everything about the coronavirus, changing. So a lot of people that I follow have been writing about Earth Day in the coronavirus era. That is, they're putting together the ideas that we talk about in how we're going to get over COVID-19 as a society with how we need to approach our problems with the environment and societies. And some of them have been very positive in describing that possibly we can. We're going to come back to the word resilience in just a little bit, but hold that thought. This is an article from Manga Bay. If you're interested in sources of information about the environment, Manga Bay is one, Grist is one. There's a number of other good ones as well. But I think before we talk about how to make a better world, we need to ask what ought to be. And I think you'll see when I raise these questions that people will not all agree about this. For example, when I think about the wild animals, and to me, 4% of wild mammal biomass being mammal biomass being wild is unacceptably low. But some people might think that's just about where it ought to be, or maybe it's too high. Maybe we don't need any wild animals at all. People have all sorts of opinions, and I think it would be helpful to ask, what percent of rivers should remain unpolluted? What percent of the world do we want to have unpolluted air? How much wilderness should there be? Do we think indigenous people ought to be allowed to live on their ancestral lands? Do you think there should be water in rivers when they reach the ocean? Some of these sound like no-brainers, but in fact, for a very good example, sometimes the Rio Grande reaches the ocean and doesn't have any water in it. But before we feel too superior, There have been a number of times, including since I've lived here, when the Ipswich River has dried for long stretches, and there hasn't been any water in that. And in both cases, it's not a drought that caused it. It's diversion of the water for human use. We could ask, should everybody get to eat meat? Is meat eating something that's really a value for us? That would mean that we'd run our world a little differently. To what extent do we believe that the world ought to be equitable? Is it acceptable to us that we have so much and others have so little? Or should we should we push for a world in which that is not the case? These are questions that I don't think all Christians would agree with, but the Bible doesn't describe this moment exactly. And so when I've looked at the Bible, there's a number of things that have really leapt out at me. One is the love of land and a sense of place. I personally resonate with that. And I see throughout the Bible the idea that you take care of land, that you love it, that part of your meaning comes from that land. The Bible emphasizes honor for God, for the creation of all creatures. You can hardly say when the Psalm says that the lion paces about seeking his food from God, that somehow lions are really bad. In fact, God provides for all the other creatures. The covenant of God, repeated after Noah's flood, was to all creatures. In fact, in that story, when God is saying to Noah, I'm not going to ever flood the world like I just did, and I'm putting up my covenant rainbow, the covenant and the ordinance that all creatures are to be fruitful and multiply was not just for humans, it was for all creatures. There's biblical verses that tell us not to cut down fruit trees, even if we're at war, and not to build house to house until the land is filled. These are throughout the Bible. On the other hand, the Bible doesn't have a lot of wisdom about global limitations, air pollution, big water pollution. And it often uses the idea of wilderness as a punishment, or the desert as a place you wander because you didn't behave. There is an emphasis on local promised land, but not on the whole earth as our home. And there's many places where the Bible says that the earth is not our home, that our home is in heaven. There's mixed messages about dangerous wild animals like lions and jackals and bears, the leviathan and the behemoth, and thorns and thistles. Sometimes they are used as an illustration of the type of thing that will punish God's people for sin, and sometimes they are used as illustrations of God's power and might. But the Bible does describe true sustainability. It promotes justice and peace, care, humility, and self-sacrifice. The other night when I was listening on Bible Gateway to Micah 4, I was really struck by this. Micah 4, verse 1, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest above the mountains. It will be exalted among the hills, and the peoples will stream to it. And then the second half of verse 3 through verse 5, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into burning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. For the Lord Almighty has spoken. All the nations may walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So one of the reasons I think that this moment in history is so striking is that many people want change. This was from a poll in the United Kingdom, April 7th through 9th, when the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission polled remarkably 4,343 adults in the UK. When people were asked what they wanted, only 9% of the adults polled want things to go back to how it was before. The vast majority of them wanted things to go to some new situation which was better and which the COVID-19 shutdown informed our move forward. This graph, also from that survey, says that people are noticing new things. They're spending less money, they're appreciating cleaner air, they are valuing food and essentials more, they have more community, they're in touch with friends and family at a distance, they see more wildlife, they feel fitter, and these are overall patterns. So if we can envision a world like we did last week when we saw actual pictures of it, a world without air pollution, could we envision a new normal that is better than what we have? What would it look like? How would we achieve it? What systems would need to change? What assumptions? What would we ourselves need to change? I am in a group of scientists and religious leaders in the Boston area called the Faith Science Alliance for Climate Leadership. And I had the privilege of hearing Mariama White-Hammond, who's a Boston pastor, speak about climate change and African American communities. In the group I was in, she was not the main speaker, but she was very striking. And she stood up and she asked whether or not the rest of us in the group asking for her help in climate change activism were also going to care as much as she did about the other concerns of her congregants. She said something to the effect, I didn't get this straight quote, I need to know that if I put in the work with this group, that the world we make will not have the same injustices of the one we are in. When I heard that, I was practically gobsmacked. It wasn't that I didn't know that climate change and other environmental degradation harms the poor the most. And I also knew that racism, both institutional and personal prejudice, have affected wealth inequality and health outcomes and many other concerns of African Americans. What I hadn't thought about was that we are remaking the world, that we could accidentally make the world exactly the same, but just be better about energy. All the same people could be wealthy. All the same people could be poor. There could be just as much racism, just as much injustice. I had always thought that if we tackled these environmental problems, especially if we were motivated because it was going to harm vulnerable people the most, that wouldn't happen. But when she said that, it really struck me that this was something we were going to have to promise to ourselves, promise to God, and to commit to. I am not the only one, and Mariama White-Hammond is not the only one making a very clear connection between environmental injustices and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on minorities and people in poverty. And as we move forward out of this, when we look for a new world that we are helping hopefully to bump into a better position, this needs to change. So let's say, suppose we wanted to make this Anthropocene better. We can't not live in the Anthropocene. We are here. This is the world we have. But we could have a better one instead of a worse one. And one of the ideas that a lot of people talk about is promoting resilience. Ecological resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to maintain or return to its normal patterns of nutrient cycling and biomass production and everything else after being subjected to damage caused by a disturbance. That can be a human-caused disturbance or a natural disturbance like a volcano. Social resilience is similar. It's the ability of a human community or even an individual to cope with and adapt to stresses and return from disturbances such as social, political, environmental, or economic change. So one of the things that we need to do is to promote resilience. Another term that you should be familiar with if you're interested in this conversation is the circular economy. I put them here on the same graph, on the same page because they both have 7 principles. I don't know if 7 is the perfect number everywhere, but in the Bible, 7 is a pretty good number. So maybe that's why they came up with this. But the Stockholm Resilience Center, which came out of the same people that wrote the paper about planetary boundaries, has a lot of resources on the things we need to do to promote resilience in society and in the environment. Likewise, a group called Metabolic, and you know what, I feel like it should have more to the name than it does, but has 7 pillars to the circular economy. Right now, we don't have a circular economy. A circular economy would be when things are not wasted, when all resources came around and were reusable. But to do that, we have to plan things differently than we do now. So here are some resources I want you to know about so that you can look up for yourself. And I did make a PDF of this PowerPoint that I will send to Jack Davis after this, and I did for the last one too, so you can have any of that you want. But this is called the Seeds of Good Anthropocene Project. And if you go to the website of Future Earth and you find this interactive map, you could go to each of these dots and you would find people doing something, like an organization doing something to promote resilience and to promote a better environment for people. Likewise, World Resources International has quite a bit of resources, and they put this up on their website saying resources to build back better. That is, other people have this same idea. How are we going to come back from COVID-19 in a better way? Likewise, I don't know if you've ever heard of Green America. They have a website, and I think they might have a magazine. They've got all sorts of things about things that you can do. This particular article was about planting seeds of climate hope because so many people have taken up gardening during this COVID-19 crisis that it's possible we'll be able to make a shift in which people think about gardening. And then for those of you who are stuck at home with kids and you're wondering what to do with yourselves, consider looking at something in citizen science. Citizen science is when scientists collect data using people who have from very minimal to actually quite a bit of training in how to collect that data and give it in. Some that are really fun, especially for kids, are Budburst and the Great Pollinator the Great Sunflower Project. Those two, if you looked them up and went to their site, would have a lot of things for families, and you can even grow your own patch of sunflowers the way they tell you to, and then you keep track of pollination, just a little bit, and then you give those data in, and you know that scientists are going to use them in their big monitoring of pollinators. There's Earth Challenge 2020 is a citizen science initiative, and it has some instructions on a variety of things that you can do to be a part of helping scientists. There are many other citizen science projects, but I want to turn our question to, will Christians lead? And one of the reasons that we just invested that sort of time in who's doing what out there is simply because when I talk to people, often they don't know what's being done. So people are understandably quite shocked and horrified sometimes by the statistics about problems in the world, but there are so many people working on things, and probably more than you realize. So my best advice to people when they want something to do is to connect to a group that is helping solve these problems. Don't reinvent the wheel, connect to a group. So one of the things that many Christians don't seem to know when I talk to them is that almost all relief and development agencies that are caring for poor around the world are very, very concerned about climate change and very concerned about environmental degradation of other types as well. And that is because this is such a multiplier of risk factors for poverty. People are pushed into poverty who had risen out of it by degradation of the environment. If you are looking to just be part of a community and follow and know what's going on, consider the Lausanne movement and the World Evangelical Alliance Creation Care group. They put out a blog called The Pollinator, Creation Care Network News, and they have Facebook pages. And this is a place where a lot of evangelical Christians, especially Christians in America, this is one of those places to go to. And I don't know if you know what some denominations are doing. I did not include Episcopalians, and the reason for that was because the Episcopal Church has a lot going on about the environment, and it's very easy to find. But even if we are at an Episcopal church, a lot of us come from different backgrounds and might want to know what's going on in other denominations. This Climate Witness Project is from the Christian Reformed Church. They, in 2012, agreed. They had a big meeting and they voted to accept the findings of a creation care task force that wrote a report. And in that report, it said climate change specifically is a huge justice issue. And so their Office of Social Justice has a special Climate Witness Project. You can see some other groups that work with them, and you can see some of the things that they are putting out there. But I know people that have worked for this Climate Witness Project, and that's pretty neat. Here are some other, and I'm saying resources, but there are other groups that you might be interested in. Arosha International is the only conservation focused Christian organization that I know of that is like runs on a missionary model. Plant with Purpose is another environmental mission group that works to alleviate local hunger and poverty issues. They started in Haiti, and their main focus is to reforest areas that have been deforested. Micah Challenge is global, and they come out of that verse in Micah, what does the Lord require of man? To do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with his God. And presumably that's women too. And that Micah Challenge is something that they connect to a lot of other groups that are doing things. And then finally, Tear Fund International is a major development organization. And I just put a little picture of a book that they put out on environmental sustainability, responding to changes in the environment and climate. And then I just want to return to hope. I feel like as I give talks, very often I plow through a lot of very disheartening information and never get to this part, or only throw it on at the very end. So I want to spend a lot more time on this. And I want to give you a verse from 1 Timothy 6:17. This is a New American Standard Bible. Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. I am a senior advisor to the group Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Their recent blog post of April 20 was 50 reasons to have hope. So if you want to see people who are utterly committed to changing the way the world works in a better way, in a way that's more Christ-like and sustainable, go and see what they have to say there. So I'm going to conclude with this. COVID-19, the crisis we're in, gives us a moment to reevaluate the world. If we're going to care for creation, we need to remake broken systems so that changes are inclusive and equitable and just. And then I've got two quotes. This one was from an April 15th letter to the editor of the Chicago Sun-Times, in which the woman said, "We can do better than going back to normal." And the other is from a song by Bruce Cockburn, who says, "The trouble with normal is that it only gets worse." So I'm going to leave us with the idea that we should not be going back to normal, that our goal is to do better than that, and that as Christians, we should be leading. Okay, that's all I've got, and I'm going to say bye there.
That's great, Dorothy. That's a great challenge. And so time for questions, Dorothy, is that all right? Great. So everyone out there, if you've been before, you kind of know the routine, but well, let's just give it another practice run here. If you take your cursor and run it over your Zoom screen, down at the bottom of your screen, there should pop up a little button that says raise hand. So if you want to practice raising your hand, you go right ahead right now. And oh, you're doing very, very well. Oh my goodness, you're all doing so great. So I'm going to lower all your hands now. And actually, Dorothy, if you remember from last week, we actually had cut off some people who had some questions. And I think 2 out of those 3 folks are here. So if you 2 people that are here also want to ask your question, a similar one to last week or another one, why don't you also raise your hand at this time? And I'll get to you first. Paul?
Good morning. Thank you, Dorothy. That was amazing. And so I'm seeing the question for me right now is how to convert Christians to be more Christian, to emphasize, to emphasize the material gain and to emphasize people and helping the world and having a global care. In other words, to think about how do we get Christians more on board with being Christian, in a sense, of caring for each other, loving each other, less getting their self-esteem less out of material things and more out of relationships and God, and caring for those globally as we would care for people in our own neighborhood. I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a really good question. And I think that there's a number of answers. I can't answer that completely, but one is to support people who are attempting to do that. Yeah. So the group Red Letter Christians was formed a number of years ago, and in response to a very strong feeling that American evangelicalism had gone awry, specifically white evangelicalism had gone awry. And I think if you were to follow something by William Barber III and any of his work with the Poor People's Campaign, that they care a lot about the environment, but they also are connecting it very strongly to other justice issues. I think if you were to support, some of those really prophetic voices, that would be helpful. The second thing I think would be that, American Christians are often the loudest voice in the room. And I think anything that you can do to promote the listening to believers from around the world would be helpful, because the way people view the environment in other parts of the world is very different. And I think that's one part of it. I think I think supporting people already doing it and adding your voice, so that some of those groups that I gave names of or information of, if you simply were to say, oh, look, they've got some sort of thing going on, like when the National Association of Evangelicals, when the Evangelical Environmental Network had their What Would Jesus Drive campaign, that gave a lot of people time to think as well. So we're not in a time when it is easy for moderate voices to be heard, or to be a person who is loudly moderate. But I think we're called to be louder.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Megan?
Hi, Megan Chase here. Dorothy, I liked your example when you were talking about the Rio Grande, and it's interesting to think about some of these issues on a world scale, but I really appreciated hearing a local example of the Ipswich River. I didn't know if you know of any other local examples that you can give, maybe that are directly here in New England, that would be relevant to some of the things you were mentioning earlier.
Well, certainly the impact of sea level rise is felt in every New England coastal town. And one of the things that I find when I talk to people locally is that, especially when I'm talking to Christians, they don't even know that, like, Danvers has a sea level rise plan. Essex has a sea level rise plan. All the way down the coast, every town has to. Or even Boston realized they had to have a sea level rise plan after Hurricane Sandy, because we were only prepared for 7-foot flood surge, and the flood surge was 14 feet, but it was down in New York, so it didn't hit us as badly as it could have. But that was a big wake-up call. So what I am struck by is that the secular world is so far ahead, not all parts of it, but the planning, urban planners are planning for this all the time. They're, you know, this kind of thing. So I think what I don't know if that's a concrete enough example.
No,
but,
that's helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Megan. Any other questions from our group out there? If you do, just raise your little blue hand. Posey? I'll unmute you, Posey. I'll try to unmute you. It's not, oh, there we go. Posey, can you hear us?
Wonderful. That was so informative and so eye-opening, and gives us lots of ammunition to carry it on to the folks that aren't aware. I'm wondering, you know, in Paul's question about how do we convince other people? Can't you? I think one thing came to mind for me, and that's lead by example.
I would say that is a really important part of it. And there are things that you can do. I know in my own life that because I'm outspoken on this, if I waited until I could get my entire household to run in a way that I thought was sustainable, I would keep quiet all the time because I can't do that. I live inside of systems that I didn't make and that I can't individually fight. So what you can do is work on the things you have any control over that are individual. But then you absolutely need to be pushing for group efforts that are, so things like knowing that Massachusetts is going to have a vote on the state level about improving transportation, energy efficiency. That would be something that I wish we would talk about as Christians, but I don't always feel like I know how to do that at the church, because I have not appreciated it when other people have been highly political in churches. And so I feel like this is the part where I'm really good at giving information, but I'm not certain what it would look like in the life of the church if we were to say, yeah, we're going to talk about things that need to change structurally in our society and promote that. But I do think one of the faults of Americans in the American church is that we do everything individually. I don't know if that was helpful at all, Posey. I'm sorry.
It is. Thank you. But I think we also can be proactive in gathering groups of same thinking and put our words into action. Yeah. And be proactive.
And that's sort of what I mean about joining groups, supporting groups, and even creating groups, rather than just individually saying, if I switch to metal straws, somehow that's going to do it. We actually need, quite a bit more change than any one of us by ourselves can trigger.
Right. Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Posey. Carolyn?
Hey, Patrick and Dorothy, it's actually Ryan. I'm here with Carolyn and Vivian and Hugh, and this is just such a great presentation, Dorothy. I actually just also wanted to go back to Paul's comment and your response. I just think, when we think about making change around any issue, I think in our divided time, I just think that the more conservative groups that you mentioned that are actually making change, I think those are just so important because they can often be heard by parts of the church, by parts of our society. My previous employer was actually part of the NAE. And I think they're forging conversations, whether it's around climate change or immigration, that are just are unusual in some of their circles, but are just so important to really moving the needle forward on things that I see so clearly in Scripture. But I think we're not always on the same page, within the American church. So I just thank you so much for that example.
Well, and I think the NAE is a good example because in 2011, they published a report that I was the lead author on about climate change. Although we had to count every single place we referred to climate change as much as possible not to say climate change. But then, you speak to your audience, right? So, so they've done some of that. Some people are very cautious. But the other place where I see a lot of this discussed is really Christianity Today is pretty good on really trying to promote sort of more holistic understanding of what it means to take care of the environment and society. Yeah, that's great. From a pretty conservative point of view.
I should just add that the NAE is the National Association of Evangelicals, for those of you out there who are wondering what the NAE is.
And if I sound like I'm, really talking a lot about evangelicalism, and not Episcopalianism, it's because this is the world I'm in, and the people that I'm struggling to love while I disagree with them and to find commonality with and to push in a direction, or to be grateful when other people are pushing in a direction. That's just where I'm at.
Thanks, Ryan. Judith?
Morning. Dorothy.
Morning.
Morning, Father Patrick. Particularly, I enjoyed this presentation even more than your first one, although your first one was very comprehensive. And I think it's very thought-provoking in terms of all the wealth of opportunities that are out there that we could get involved in. But I, like Posey, prefer to do something local because it's easier and you feel like perhaps you might have a little bit more of an impact. But I do think I'm pleased that Christchurch at least is involved in helping to develop housing for people who are an underserved population. And that's a huge issue in our area. And this whole equity issue obviously is part of that. But I don't have any specific questions, but I do want to get copies through Jack of the presentations with all the notations. So thank you. That was really excellent. And I forgive you for not promoting Protestantism or Episcopalianism versus evangelicalism. Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Thanks, Judith. Tom? Tom?
Well, it's actually Huntley.
Huntley?
Like to be on camera or anything. Dorothy, thank you so much. I am humbly educated by you every time you speak. This is an area that I care deeply about, but am not equipped to, at this point, to have participated as fully as I would like. But one of the things I was thinking about in connection with Paul's comments is that to be able to get your presentation, I would like to send it to my Christian friends. Because I think in the conversations I've had before as a sort of as a bridge builder and somewhat of a evangelist, that they don't think Christians care at all about the environment. And so I think it's very important to be able to share your presentation with some of my friends that are scientists and are out there doing things and just are not educated from the Christian point of view, that yes, there are people who do deeply care about this and are working to do something about it. So I really thank you for putting this presentation together as an evangelistic tool that I can use to send out worldwide to people who have not really felt that Christians have participated in this at all. So it's an educational tool around the world. And also, you've given me, I'm planting seeds for the first time. I'm not a gardener. I'm learning how to do this in just small ways. But also, you know, in the Haiti project, learning how to help sustainability and forest, you know, reforesting and all of those things. So I've been learning just by participating in the little places I do. But I really thank you for widening my scope and showing me ways that I can participate. And as far as Christ Church, like in all things, Patrick is so supportive of any kind of group effort that wants to get together. So if this were to emerge as a, you know, Christ Church climate change endeavor like ECHO or something else, I'm sure if there was a movement in that direction that showed some kind of structure and form that was useful, we could present something as a church to our area or to the world and have that happen if that was God's plan to raise that up. So thank you for sparking all of this. I don't want to go back to the old normal. I'm looking forward to new creative ways to live, and you've helped a great deal in spurring my thinking. So thank you.
Thank you. And Huntley, let me say that idea that this is a part of our testimony is something that young people understand. And I've said it for years because I saw that I was meeting young people who said, I can't go along with Christianity because I care about the environment and I'm not hearing that voice. And that's one of the reasons why organizations like Young Evangelicals or Climate Action are so striking. They get in the news, they get interviewed, they get all sorts of things because it's so wanted by the world. People want to hear that voice. And I think, you know as much as I do that there's like an intergenerational difference in among evangelicals, and young evangelicals are just at a different place. But part of even having people that grow up in the church, remain in the church, has got to be being able to intelligently deal with the problems of the day. And so I see it as a place where I think we're going to have a lot of ministry opportunities. So thank you for saying that. And I'll pull together a little resource list because there's a lot of people writing about it and talking about it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Huntley. So just like last time, Dorothy, we still got questions, but I want to be mindful of the time. So I'm so sorry to you folks who still have your hands raised, but I'm sure Dorothy would be happy to chat with you offline if you have other questions or comments. So feel free to reach out to Dorothy. Maybe Dorothy in the chat, you could put your email in case those folks don't have it. But at this time, so thank you, Dorothy, for stimulating lots of good thoughts for us. I'm going to stop the recording. And